Picture this. You're sitting on your couch, you open an app on your phone, and you find that that highly specific, kind of obscure gadget you've been looking for.
Oh, yeah. We've all been there.
Right. And you just click buy. You don't even think twice about it. You just wait for a cardboard box to magically appear on your doorstep a few days later.
It feels completely effortless.
Yeah, exactly. Like turning on a tap and getting water.
Yeah.
But behind that single simple click is this high-stakes, globally choreographed dance of risk, law, and logistics that's, it's almost entirely invisible to the everyday consumer.
It is a massive undertaking. We're talking about moving millions of tons of physical goods across imaginary lines on a map.
Right.
And you're dealing with dozens of different languages, volatile currencies, conflicting legal systems, all while a company is just desperately trying to protect its profit margins.
Well, today we are tearing into the mechanics of that invisible dance. We're doing a deep dive using the APICS Certified Supply Chain Professional Guidelines.
Specifically, we're looking at the trade considerations in Module 5, Section C.
Yes, exactly. That's our map for today. And our mission here is to demystify how goods actually cross borders safely, legally, and, profitably. We really want to get into the weeds of the strategies companies use to survive this whole gauntlet.
Which I think is a great framework. Because my core belief when analyzing supply chains is that mastering global trade isn't just like a compliance exercise.
It's not just checking boxes.
Exactly. It's not just about filling out forms so you don't get fined. It's a massive strategic advantage. The companies that deeply understand this ecosystem, they don't just survive it. They actively use the rules to outmaneuver their competition.
I really love that perspective. So let's start at the ultimate choke point. Before a product can move anywhere, it has to be allowed to move.
The international borders.
Right, specifically customs. Now, anyone who follows global business knows customs acts as a massive risk filter. But what really stands out in the APCS material is the inherent friction in their mandate.
Oh, absolutely. They're pulled in two totally different directions.
Yeah. They're trying to collect revenue for the government through tariffs, but they are also tasked with protecting domestic industries and public safety. So it's like they want to let things in to make money, but keep things out to keep people safe.
And that tension dictates literally everything they do. Customs is this massive, complex filter, and the rules governing it can change overnight based on global events.
The source text gives a pretty stark example of that, right?
It does. It mentions the 2011 nuclear reactor damage in Japan. The U.S. government didn't wait around to see what would happen.
He just acted.
Right. They immediately halted imports of Japanese milk, fruits, and vegetables because of radiation concerns. Or think about those sweeping bans on toys that were discovered to contain lead paint.
Right, of course.
That customs filter has to catch all of that in real time across thousands of ports of entry.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because catching physical, glowing radioactive milk makes intuitive sense.
Sure.
But the text also brings up this concept called a deemed export, which frankly blew my mind.
It's a tricky one.
It really is. It says that if you release certain software or technology to a foreign national who is working inside your own country, you might be required to have an export license.
Yeah, that is a perfect illustration of how invisible the border can actually be.
Right. So imagine like a software engineer in a Silicon Valley cafeteria. They show a piece of proprietary code on their laptop to a colleague who happens to be on a work visa.
Just showing them the screen.
Just showing the screen. If that code is restricted, the U.S. government considers that an export. It's like accidentally smuggling corporate secrets without the goods ever leaving the building.
What's fascinating there is the legal philosophy behind it. You didn't ship a physical box, but the intellectual property crossed a jurisdictional border just by virtue of whose eyes looked at it.
That is wild.
It highlights the extreme vigilance companies have to maintain. And, doesn't stop at intellectual property. They also have to navigate incredibly diverse labor laws across these borders.
Oh, right. Because it's not just the product, it's how it's made.
Exactly. A company has to ensure their supply chain complies with everything from collective bargaining rights in one country to, say, individual worker protections in another, often simultaneously.
But practically speaking, how does a multinational company keep up with all this without drowning in red tape? If I'm importing laptops and I have to track the cobalt in the battery, the labor laws in the assembly plant, the software on the hard drive, and the shifting tariffs.
It's a lot.
It's insane. How do I even know what I don't know?
Well, they rely on a process called compliance gap analysis. A company can't just cross its fingers and hope for the best.
Right, hope is not a strategy.
Definitely not. They systematically identify the mandatory standards of the country they're trying to enter, assess their current operations against those baselines, and then build project plans to close the gaps.
Okay, that makes sense.
But governments also know this is incredibly burdensome, so they offer voluntary security partnerships to, grease the wheels a bit. In the U.S., the major one is CTPAT.
That's the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, right?
Yes, exactly.
I read up on CTPAT in the text, and it sounds a bit like TSA PreCheck, but for cargo ships.
That's a pretty good way to look at it.
It's voluntary, and it relies on self-policing. Companies agree to audit their own supply chain security, and in exchange, Customs treats them as a lower-risk entity. But does that actually give them a free pass at the border?
Oh, no, it definitely isn't a free pass. The text explicitly notes that CTPAT membership does not guarantee you won't be inspected.
Okay, so you can still get pulled over, so to speak.
Exactly. Nor does it guarantee faster clearance times for every single shipment. But the math works in their favor over time.
How so?
They get fewer routine inspections overall, and they get assigned a dedicated account manager from Customs to help untangle issues when they do arise. It's really about shifting the risk profile.
Got it. It sounds like surviving Customs, even with programs like CTPAT, requires everyone in the supply chain to be hyper-aligned.
Absolutely.
If the buyer, the seller, and the government aren't on exactly the same page about who is holding the bag at every single inch of the journey, the financial liability would be astronomical.
Which is exactly why the world of global trade had to invent its own universal language.
Right, because you can't rely on a handshake or a loose translation.
Exactly. Not when millions of dollars of cargo are floating across the ocean.
So enter the acronym SOUP, Incoterms. Specifically, the text outlines Incoterms 2020. These are the standardized three-letter rules published by the International Chamber of Commerce.
And they are crucial.
They really are. They define exactly when the transfer of cost and risk happens between a buyer and a seller. I like to think of it like deciding up front who pays for the Uber ride and who pays the medical bills if the Uber crashes on the way to the restaurant.
That's a great analogy. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Incoterms are pretty much the only thing preventing a tidal wave of international lawsuits. They dictate who pays for the freight, who is responsible for the insurance, and the exact geographic centimeter where the risk shifts from the seller to the buyer.
Well, let's talk about the extremes of these terms because they really paint a picture. On one end, you have EXW, or Ex-Works.
Ah, yes, Ex-Works.
Under EXW, the buyer is doing all the heavy lifting. The buyer basically has to show up at the seller's factory floor in a foreign country, load the goods onto a truck themselves, and figure out how to clear export customs under a foreign government's rules.
It's an immense burden. The seller essentially just places the goods by their own loading dock and says, good luck.
Just wipes their hands of it.
Pretty much. It's rarely recommended unless the buyer happens to have a massive, sophisticated logistical footprint already established in the seller's country.
And then on the complete opposite end of the spectrum is DDP, delivered duty paid.
The gold standard for the buyer.
Right. Here, the seller acts like a concierge. They pay for the freight, they assume all the risk during transit, and they even pay the import duties to get the goods cleared through customs and dropped right at the buyer's doorstep.
It's the ultimate hands-off experience for the buyer. But navigating the space between those two extremes, that's where companies constantly stumble.
Yeah, the middle ground is messy.
Very. The APICS text highlights a very common, very expensive mistake regarding the term FOB.
Right, free on board. It's probably the most famous Incoterm, but people use it completely wrong all the time.
They really do.
The text clearly states FOB is strictly designed for sea and inland waterway transport. The risk transfers when the goods are literally physically on board the vessel, but people use it for air freight.
Which creates a massive legal black hole. Let's say a buyer and seller agree to FOB for a shipment of microchips flying out of LAX.
Okay.
A forklift operator drops the pallet on the tarmac before it gets loaded onto the airplane. The seller says, it was at the airport, you pay for it. And the buyer says, it never crossed a ship's rail, you pay for it. Because they used a maritime rule for an airplane, the contract is ambiguous, and they're going to spend millions in legal fees fighting over a three-letter acronym.
That is terrifying for a business owner. But, I noticed a massive loophole in the text. Incoterms govern risk and cost, but they are completely silent on the transfer of title.
Yes. That is a huge distinction.
meaning they do not dictate who legally owns the goods.
Hmm.
If I'm an amateur importer and I just paid $50,000 for freight under a certain Incoterm, I'd naturally assume I own the cargo.
And the real trap there is assuming risk equals ownership. It absolutely doesn't.
Wow.
You might be holding the risk if the ship sinks, but the transfer of legal title has to be explicitly spelled out in the actual purchase order or the commercial contract of sale. Incoterms only handle the physical reality of the movement.
Okay, so if I'm an importer exposed to all this liability, I don't fully grasp the Incoterms, and I definitely don't have a team in-house to clear goods through foreign customs. I'd imagine most companies simply can't do this alone. Who are they hiring to offload this liability?
They turn to a hidden army of third-party specialists, the intermediaries.
The fixers.
Exactly, the fixers of global trade. First and foremost, you have customs house brokers. According to the text, these are the only entities legally licensed to transact business with customs and pay duties on an importer's behalf.
So they hold the keys to the gate. You literally cannot clear significant commercial freight without them.
Pretty much.
But the text also breaks down strategic intermediaries that help you sell your goods abroad. It distinguishes between export management companies, or EMCs, and export trading companies, ETCs.
Right. Think of an EMC as your outsourced export department. They act as consultants.
Like a guide.
Yeah, they help you navigate the local culture, translate the marketing, handle local regulations. But at the end of the day, your company still owns the goods and takes the financial risk.
Whereas an ETC actually buys the goods from you domestically and resells them internationally on their own dime.
Exactly.
The text highlights Japan's massive Sogo Shosha conglomerates. Companies like Mitsubishi or Mitsui operate as giant ETCs, handling a staggering percentage of Japan's total foreign trade. They take the ownership risk completely off the manufacturer's plate.
They do. And speaking of intermediaries taking on risk, the logistics side has its own fascinating fixers. The NVOCCs, or non-vessel operating common carriers.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. The origin story of the NVOCC is just brilliant.
It really is a great piece of history.
Back in the 1970s, you had all these trains and trucks returning to ports completely empty after dropping off cargo inland. The industry called it deadheading.
Just burning fuel for nothing.
Exactly, a massive waste of money. So these new entities, the NVOCCs, started buying up this empty space at a steep discount from the carriers and then reselling that space to smaller shippers.
It created an incredibly efficient secondary market. The carriers made money on return trips that would have otherwise been a total loss, and smaller shippers got discounted freight rates because the NVOCC was consolidating their small pallets into full, profitable containers.
It's basically Airbnb for empty truck and ship space, but invented 50 years ago.
That's exactly what it is.
But, it makes me wonder, if you're a major corporation shipping high volumes, why wouldn't you just cut out the middleman? Why pay an NVOCC or a freight forwarder a markup when you could just negotiate with the ocean liner yourself?
Because the sheer complexity of foreign networks makes that a losing game. When you hire a freight forwarder, you aren't just paying for cargo space.
What are you paying for then?
You're paying for their decades of relationships, their fluency in obscure local regulations, and their ability to pivot instantly. If a port in Rotterdam goes on strike, or a container gets bumped off a ship in Shanghai, they know exactly who to call to reroute it. Replicating that kind of infrastructure internally across 50 different countries is infinitely more expensive than paying a forwarder's markup.
That makes a lot of sense. You're buying agility.
Precisely.
But all the agility in the world doesn't matter if the physical boxes are packed wrong or have the wrong paperwork taped to the side. Which brings us to the intense physical reality of trade outlined in this source.
The paper trail and the packaging. Passports for products, essentially.
Yeah. The text points out that packaging isn't just about keeping a fragile item safe. It actually dictates your entire logistics strategy.
Oh, absolutely.
For instance, air freight requires minimal packaging. It's a gentle ride, and weight is at an absolute premium. But ocean freight is violent. It requires heavy internal bracing to survive rough seas and being stacked 10 containers high.
And here is a critical, often overlooked detail. Your packaging directly impacts your taxes. In some countries, customs assesses import duties based on the total weight of the cargo, which includes the packaging itself.
Wait, really?
Yes. If you overpackage a product in heavy, thick wood crates for a country that taxes by gross weight, you are literally paying a tariff on the wood.
Wow. Every ounce literally counts against your bottom line.
It does.
But the most intense part of the paperwork has to be the harmonized tariff schedule, or the HTS.
It is the absolute backbone of global trade. Over 98% of global merchandise trade is classified using the 6 to 10-digit code system.
It's massive.
It's how a customs officer in any country knows exactly what is in the box and what tariff percentage to apply.
It's like the ultimate high-stakes Dewey Decimal System for the entire planet. But the specificity is wild. The APICS text points out that Japan uses 39 different 9-digit codes just to classify its salmon imports.
39 codes.
Fresh, frozen, chilled fillets. 39 codes just for salmon.
This raises an important question about precision and the role of those customs house brokers we mentioned earlier. Let's say a ship arrives in Tokyo loaded with salmon.
Okay.
The customs officer might look at it and declare it falls under a code for frozen salmon, which might carry a 10% tariff. But your customs broker argues that based on the exact temperature logs of the shipping container, it legally qualifies as chilled salmon, which maybe only carries a 2% tariff.
So the broker's job is literally arguing the legal definition of a dead fish's temperature to save the importer hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Exactly that. The difference between those codes can make or break a company's profit margin for the entire year. And the strictness applies to the transport documents as well.
Right.
The text highlights a massive difference between an ocean bill of lading and an airway bill. An ocean bill of lading actually provides title to the goods and is a negotiable instrument.
Meaning you can legally buy and sell the cargo while it is literally floating in the middle of the Pacific Ocean just by endorsing the document.
Yes, it acts as the physical representation of the goods. But an airway bill, used for cargo flights, is entirely different. It is strictly a receipt and evidence of transport.
It doesn't prove ownership.
Right. It does not confer ownership. If a company confuses the two and tries to use an airway bill to secure a bank letter of credit, the transaction will fail and the goods will be stuck on the tarmac.
So what does this all mean for a company trying to survive this? If the paperwork is this intense, the codes are this granular, and the borders are this strict, is there any legal way to bypass the friction?
There is, and it brings us to the ultimate trade hack. Creating geographic zones where the normal rules simply do not apply.
Let's talk about free trade zones, or FTZs. These are specific designated areas that are geographically inside a country's borders, but legally they're considered outside that country's customs territory.
Yes, that's the key distinction.
I like to think of them like embassies, a little piece of no man's land right on your own soil.
And they are incredibly powerful tools for economic stimulation. For example, companies can bring foreign goods into an FTZ to store them indefinitely and defer paying taxes until they actually find a buyer.
That's a huge cash flow advantage.
Huge! Or if a shipment arrives with mislabeled packaging, which would normally trigger a massive customs fine at the border, the company can bring it into the FTZ, hire workers to fix the labels, and then formally enter it into the country's customs territory without any penalty.
But the coolest trick in the book has to be the inverted duty hack.
It's a brilliant piece of strategy. Sometimes a country's tariff schedule is structured in a way that importing raw components actually costs a higher tariff percentage than importing a finished, fully assembled product.
That feels backwards.
It does, but that is an inverted duty.
Right, so let's break down the math. Say a country charges a 2% tariff on a finished imported car, but the steering wheels, the engines, and the tires each carry a 5% tariff if imported individually.
So what a smart strategic company will do is ship all those foreign car parts into an FTZ located in the destination country. Okay.
Remember, they don't pay customs duties when crossing into the FTZ. They hire local workers to assemble the car inside that zone. Then, they formally import the finished car out of the FTZ across the imaginary line into the host country's domestic market, and they only pay the lower 2% tariff on the finished good.
It's incredibly clever. But it makes me ask, if FTZs allow companies to legally bypass these inverted duties and effectively reduce the government's tariff revenue, why on earth do countries eagerly build these zones?
Because the lost tariff revenue is completely eclipsed by the broader economic benefits. By allowing that assembly to happen inside the FTZ, the host country just created local manufacturing jobs, stimulated the local economy, and attracted foreign direct investment that might have otherwise gone to a neighboring country.
Oh, I see. It's a calculated trade-off.
Exactly.
And if FTZs are so effective at bypassing local tariffs on your own soil, it creates a weird competitive dynamic with those neighboring countries. At what point do governments just give up on the borders entirely and harmonize their rules? That seems to be the driving force behind trading blocs. It is. Trading blocks operate on a similar principle of removing trade barriers, but scaled up across entire regions.
Right.
The text specifically details the transition from NAFTA to the USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Looking at the mechanics outlined in the source, we see several specific strategic shifts designed to tighten regional integration.
The rules of origin changed significantly, right? Under NAFTA, to qualify for zero tariffs, a car needed 62.5% of its parts made in North America. Under the USMCA, that threshold jumped to 75%.
It did. It also forced Canada to open up 3.6% of its highly protected dairy market to U.S. exports.
Interesting.
And perhaps most uniquely, it introduced a 16-year sunset clause. The agreement automatically expires in 2036 unless all three nations actively agree to renew it.
So it's a mechanism to force continuous political engagement.
Exactly.
But the USMCA isn't just a political choice. It's practically a submission to an economic principle the text calls the gravity model.
Yes. The gravity model states that countries that are geographically closer to each other will naturally trade more with each other. Capital is lazy. It wants the shortest, cheapest route possible.
Makes total sense.
It is simply faster to move goods across a shared land border on a train than across the Pacific Ocean on a ship. Trading blocks just lean into this natural gravity. They are essentially governments legally paving the roads that geography already built, removing the friction of Paris to accelerate the trade that was inevitably going to happen anyway.
Wow. So to pull all of this together, what an incredible journey through the mechanics of the global economy.
It really is a lot to take in.
We started at the strict, unyielding gates of customs, where governments constantly weigh the desire for revenue against the demand for security. We learned to speak the language of Incoterms, figuring out exactly who is left holding the bag when a shipment goes wrong.
The dreaded FOB mistake.
Yes. We explored the fixers, from the brokers negotiating Japanese salmon codes to the NVOCC's flipping empty truck space in the 70s. And finally, we looked at how geography itself is weaponized, bending the rules through free trade zones and trading blocks driven by the gravity model.
It really reframes how you look at the physical world. When you understand this framework, you realize that global trade isn't just about ships and cardboard boxes. It is a continuously evolving, high-stakes, legal and strategic puzzle.
Understanding this turns you from a passive consumer into someone who actually sees the levers of the world economy working behind the scenes. But I want to leave you with a final thought today, something to mull over that builds on everything we've just discussed from the APC's material.
I love a good thought experiment. Where are we heading?
Well, our entire source text today is built around the intense, heavy physical reality of trade. We spent this whole time talking about ocean liners, heavy wooden packaging, stamped bills of lading, and physical border checkpoints. But what happens to customs? What happens to HTS codes? And what happens to Incoterms when global trade shifts heavily toward 3D printing and digital manufacturing?
Oh, wow. That raises an important question for the entire future of logistics and taxation.
Think about it.
Yeah.
How will a country inspect, tariff, or apply a rule of origin to a product when the import isn't a heavy box on a cargo ship, but just a downloaded design file printed right there in your living room?
That changes everything.
It really does. The next time you click buy, ask yourself, in 10 years, will you be waiting for a box to clear customs or just waiting for a download to finish? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. See you next time.